Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Be the Wolf. I am here today with Soha, and we're going to dig into her own journey of discovering her voice. And here's the thing, entrepreneurs especially, you need to tap into your true, authentic voice to be successful and happy. You can totally be, quote, successful without moving from your true, authentic voice. But the odds of you being happy and satisfied and fulfilled and successful without doing that is very, very slim. So, Soha, can you tell us a bit about what it is that you do specifically? And maybe if you have some other insight as to why it's important for entrepreneurs specifically to discover their own voice, tap into that too.
Yeah. I am the founder of a company called Voice Coaching for Creatives, and that is an umbrella for a couple different things I do to help people with their voices. And that ranges from I used to do clinical voice, so I'm a trained speech pathologist. Before that, I had an opera degree. So I mostly work with professional opera singers who are having trouble with their voices in the voice rehabilitation realm now. I don't do clinical work anymore. And then because when I was doing my clinical work, I noticed that there was so much psychology involved and a lot of spirituality too involved in working with the voice. So then I got a second master's degree in Jungian and archetypal studies because I wanted to bring the work of Carl Jung and the archetypes into voice work. So that I have developed into my own coaching program that I call Soundscapes of the Psyche, where I do a recording of people's voices and then help them hear their own voices in a similar way to the way that I do, which is to hear the intuition, to hear the wisdom, and to hear the strength and power. And as for your other question, in terms of why entrepreneurs need to find their voices, I think the whole point of being an entrepreneur is doing your own thing. It's being your own boss. It's not succumbing to the authority of anyone else's whim. You want to be your own authority. And the way you become your own authority is honestly through the voice. And voice, we mean that literally in terms of actually speaking and being heard literally, but we also mean it figuratively in terms of being able to check in to your inner source of power, your inner strength, and the sort of the core essence of who you are, and then decide when and how and why you want to share it.
One of the things, ironically, I just did an episode on decisions. And one of the things that I spoke about was being able to make your decisions from a place of authenticity. And when you have indecision, it's a sign that you're not being authentic, that there is this place where you're trying to step into what is true and the creative vision of you, and then you're trying to prevent something. And when you're trying to prevent, you can't be authentic because you're not operating from a neutral place. And authenticity is, they've measured it, is the highest frequency of emotion, of a feeling that a human can emit.
Makes sense.
So your own journey, you didn't wake up and just be like, magically, this is what I'm doing. Your own journey has really been a uncovering of your own voice. And from what we talked about before, it seems like every time you unearthed another layer of your voice, that it opened up possibility, expansion, and fulfillment in your life and in your business. Is that correct?
100%.
100%. Well, let's go down this road because I think every entrepreneur really understands this path. I mean, some people knew they wanted to be an entrepreneur right off the bat, but they still had to go through this process of finding their own voice. And creatives out there, you are entrepreneurs whether you know it or not, because most creatives I know want to make a living from their creativity. And there, of course, is that starving artist mythology. I'm going to call it mythology because it is not the way it has to be. But when you keep moving from that authenticity, your own voice, that creativity, that's where you can actually create abundance versus moving from that prevent and protect place. That's where you stifle your voice and your creativity. What you create becomes carbon copy, becomes inauthentic, and becomes not anything that's going to drive you forward. So let's dive into your story. You started as an opera singer.
Yeah, so I sang my whole life, and I was that kid from preschool onward who was identified as having a pretty voice. And so I was always supported to sing. I remember I was in Montessori school for preschool, and I remember even as a 3-year-old, I would go into the music room. I think our music teacher came in like once or twice a week to teach us music. And I would just wander off and go sit in the music room and wait, because that was all I wanted to do, was be around sound and music. And I just loved it from that time. And they would come find me in the music room and they're like, "Oh, no, no, she's not coming until Tuesday." And I'm like, "I don't care. I'll wait. Like, it's fine. I'm patient. No big deal." So that was always my trajectory. And I used to go out, even at that Montessori school, they had a swing set in the back, and I'd go and I'd sing to the birds. And I felt like this real sense that I was communicating with them, that there was real authentic communication. So when I look back at those memories, I think it was, for me, it was all about communication. It was all about the spiritual, some idea that what we see here is not all there is, and that music, sound, communication, even with other worlds, other realms, is really real and important. And I think I always felt that. And I don't think that's changed. It's changed form. I still communicate with birds, but it's changed. It's changed form, but it still forms the core essence of who I am.
It's interesting. We look back at our childhood and those things that we really loved, and those are such crumbs and pieces to our true authentic voice and what's really important to us. One of my core values is expression. And when I was little, I also loved to sing.
Mm.
I would walk down the street singing about everything that I saw. It was my favorite thing in the world until I was 6 years old, and my music teacher made everybody audition for the solo, and I sang my whole heart out, and she just looked at me and was like, "No," and then proceeded to
Oh,
shame me in front of the whole class. I
no.
already had self-doubt in myself at that young age, so I just shut my voice down completely, and I think a lot of people out there have had similar experiences, whether you were singing or you were told you were too much or whatever it would be that you just shut down. So you went into opera
Mhm.
and then you literally got shut down.
Yeah, I started in high school when I was training my voice, but I developed this little crack in my voice, and anatomically everything was fine, physically everything was fine, but when I sang, it would just randomly crack. And there may be some either congenital scar tissue or something that developed beneath the visible level of the vocal fold that sort of is in there that can't really be detected, but there's nothing detectable. So my voice was always beautiful. They just thought it was a technical thing that I'd be able to iron out. And so I went to college and I studied opera, and it wasn't getting ironed out. And as even though I improved my technique and switched teachers and did all that, I still had this crack in my voice. And when I went to finally, when I went to the doctor in my undergrad, I went to a voice clinic, and they had a voice specialized speech pathologist working with the ear, nose, and throat doctor, but she wasn't a singer. So she was specializing in voice, but it was speaking voice. And so she couldn't understand really how intertwined my voice was with my identity and how important singing was to me. So she was handing me worksheets and giving me formulaic exercises, and there wasn't a lot of empathy. There wasn't a lot of counseling or questioning or understanding. And from that moment, because I couldn't go on an audition and be a singer because my voice wasn't working perfectly, which you need it to for opera, I decided to go get a master's degree in speech pathology and study voice myself so that I could, A, understand the science, see if I could fix what was going on in my own voice. And then also, I wanted to be able to help other people who were in the same situation. I wanted to be able to bring all the things to other people that I didn't receive when I needed them.
It's really interesting how a lot of times our trajectory of what we do is about trying to fix a problem that we have.
Mhm.
And I'm struck by, and I know in the medical field, people have this experience all the time where I know there's something wrong with me, but I go to doctor after doctor after doctor, and there's nothing they can do. They keep saying, "You're not doing the thing right enough. You're not, blah, blah, blah." But you're putting your all into it,
Mhm.
and it's not working. And so you were doing that. Nobody could help you. A lot of my clients end up coming to me because they're like, "I'm doing all the business strategies. Everybody says I'm doing it right. They don't understand why it's not working." And there's something deeper going on. So, as you went into speech pathology, tell me about your journey there. How did you figure out how to fix the crack in your voice?
For the most part, yeah. I mean, I think I figured out a couple things. I think once you get into the archetypes and mythology and that kind of thing, you start to learn about this concept of the wounded healer or, you know, what is the purpose and meaning of our lives, right? So because I couldn't just go on a linear straight path to what I thought I was supposed to do, in some sense, I was sort of forced into looking at my life more spiritually. Oops, sun's coming out. I'm in Iowa, and so the sun doesn't often come out. So I was not expecting sun. So now I'm striped. Let's see. There we go. So yeah. So I think that we think of these things as something got in the way, something broke, something interrupted my linear trajectory. But if you look at it from a more feminine consciousness, a more spiritual consciousness, that is the trajectory. So the broken leg when you're a basketball player, the divorce, the like you name it, the being fired from a job, especially if you have an entrepreneurial spirit, these things that look like obstacles in your journey so often are the roadmap. And they're showing you exactly why you were put on the planet and what you were really put here to do. And there's no mistake. I mean, I spent 20, 25 years working clinically. So I gathered all these puzzle pieces. I got to work with thousands of clients. I got to be one on one with human beings and really get sort of intimately connected with their stories and their narratives and understand humanity, all from sitting in one chair. I mean, I've traveled a lot too, but the idea that I can sit in a chair and then thousands of people from all walks of life will come to me and I get to meet this entire spectrum and gamut of humanity, that's not a mistake. Those are all puzzle pieces in my life that I then get to put together. And that the idea that the image or the myth of the broken voice, I can't get away from that. It's in me, it's part of who I am. And so, a trajectory is to spend my life trying to heal it, which is what a lot of opera singers that I work with do, right? They come to me, they have an injured voice, they still think that their purpose is to sing, and maybe it is. And the journey of healing the voice is part of that journey, and it makes them a better singer. And that can be true of athletes or, you know, Olympic athletes, people who are trying to get to the height of their game in anything. The obstacle is the way. And so at this point in my trajectory, I can finally see, oh, those were all pieces. They were all intuitive breadcrumbs. They were all part of it. When you're in it, it doesn't always feel great. When we're in it, it can feel like, why is my life so broken and messy? And why is this not working? But I have yet to work with a professional opera singer who has not gotten to the other side of it and said, I'm stronger, I'm better, I understand myself more, I'm more committed, I'm clearer on life, I've gone into the depths of my being, I've connected with my soul, I know who I am. And I don't know, and I don't think it's true for necessarily everyone, but some of us, for whatever reason, we're on this sort of spiritual, soul based path and there's no way to get around it. You're gonna start on a trajectory, you're gonna hit an obstacle, you're gonna suffer, you're gonna work through the suffering, and then that working through is gonna show you how you're meant to help others. So I just think it's a well-worn path for many people.
It is a well-worn path. They call it the hero's journey. I always like to believe that the universe is working for me, meaning every obstacle is here for me so that I can either fulfill my purpose, get and create what I truly want in life, any of those things. And so I've had many of obstacles. And I have looked at many of them with a positive outlook and many of them with a why is this happening to me outlook. But I think the reality is that obstacles are always going to be there, and how you choose to move through them will dictate what you get on the other side. So if you are a singer and your voice isn't working and you have decided, well, the universe or something must be here to teach me something, to gain a skill, to get some strength, to get something that I will need to really achieve my goal. If you can look at it, if really look at it, I don't mean just tell yourself this like it's a little candy cane or whatever, just to pacify yourself to get through. But if you can really believe that, then you will get the positive outcome, I think.
You'll get the outcome. And I think the positive part is that you're living in alignment with your soul. And if you live long enough on the planet, you look around and of course some of the stuff that's happening on the planet is makes no sense. You can't make sense of it. But I think that's for me where the spiritual element comes in or the psychological or soul element comes in is that and I just turned 50 a couple months ago and I think the longer you live on the planet, the more things start to come together and you can in retrospect make sense of a life. That doesn't mean that it was all sweet or beautiful or easy or that any of it was sweet or beautiful
Right.
or easy necessarily. I mean, some people pull some pretty rough cards. And my thing is always like you get to the planet, you either come with your deck or you're dealt cards as you go along. You pick them up and you got to play your card. And I agree with you that you play your card to the best of your ability, and that is the life. That turns out to be your life. It might be a tragedy, it might be a comedy, it might be a romance, I don't know. But you're playing out the narrative of your life. And in some ways, there's no way to do that wrong. But you are going to be dealt cards. And who you become in the face of each card you're dealt determines what your story looks like. It determines your narrative. And yeah, sometimes you aren't going to get a lot of control over that because some cards aren't great and some cards, no matter which way you play them, you're stuck. And that idea, what you mentioned before, of when there's a choice, when you're stuck in that ambivalence, I absolutely believe that when we're stuck in that ambivalence is because we're not hearing our own voice. So, this idea of having two decisions, both of which look bad or wrong, Carl Jung called that the tension of opposites. And he said that when we're in the tension of opposites, that is the definition of a neurosis. That is the definition of mental illness or of mental struggle, of pain, of suffering, is having ambivalence, not knowing should I go this way or that way, not knowing how to move forward. And that the only thing to really do is do the work and wait for that, what he called the transcendent third, to show up. So if you're stuck between two options, there's got to be some better way. And to me, that's hearing your own voice. If you're stuck between two things, it's because you're not able to or willing to commit to the risk of listening to and following your own core self and soul.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to what I was talking about earlier with the decisions of what is that true decision for you?
Agreed.
When you move from that place, you are moving from this place of creation. Because
Yeah.
I think we as humans, if we get spiritual about it, we are creation. And in some circles, it's said that we're a reflection of God. Well, if God is creation, then are we not creation? So if we're moving from prevent mode, we're not creating anything. So to listen to the truth of who you are and listen to that voice and learn that voice and keep leaning into it allows us to create. Now, when you went from having the crack in your voice, okay, you cannot be an opera singer,
Mhm.
to leaning into how do I heal myself, where was the piece where you listened more to your voice? How was that transition for you as far as listening more to your voice versus trying to stay, well, I'm going to fight through it and be an opera singer anyway? Tell me tell me about that transition.
Well, I mean, from the time I finished my graduate degree in speech pathology to going into my clinical work in speech pathology until I quit 20 some years later, I was suffering. I was unhappy. I was physically getting random symptoms. I was depressed. I was exhausted. I was ambivalent. I loved my work. I loved my patients. I hated my job. I hated a lot of my patients. And so it was like I had this deep sense that I was both on and off purpose at the same time. And that for me was a hell realm. And so in that hell realm, I was seeking out therapy. I was seeking out coaching. I was seeking out anything that might heal that pain and suffering and explain to me why I felt so on purpose and so off purpose at the same time. So there was always this sense of, am I being called to do something else? And like you said earlier, you can be really successful and still feel miserable. And I was at the top of my game. I held some of the best positions in the country in my field. I was well respected. I was good at my job. I was helping people. And my brothers, who are both attorneys, would look at me and they're like, what are you complaining about? Your life's perfect. You're combining your art and science together and getting paid for it. Your patients are telling you you're changing their lives every day. They're like, we're attorneys. The idea that we even get a thank you is like unheard of. All we get is complaints all day long. And where's that extra $1,000? And they're in a world where they're working not really feeling satisfied, even though financially they're successful.
Right.
On paper, they're successful. Their hearts and souls are getting mutilated. So they would look at me and they were like, I don't get it. You're good at what you do. You're well respected. You everywhere you show up for a job, they hire you because your skill set's so unique and you have such great recommendations coming in that you never have to want for a job. What is your problem? And I think for me, the problem, well, I mean, it took me 20 plus 30 years to do the, go through it. I think the problem, if there was one, was that yes, the skill set was right. And yes, the parts, the pieces of the puzzle were right, but I wanted to put them together in my own way. We were talking about this idea of if not your voice, then whose voice? And if, like me, you get educated and you get formal education, if you don't intentionally find your own way, you're just regurgitating the voices of mostly dead white European men. And so those are the people who created the canon. They're the people who wrote all the philosophy and science books we're supposed to read. They're the people who came up with thought, essentially, back to the time of Socrates. And so my question was, well, if I'm going to be authentic in my own voice, how do I take these puzzle pieces that I've accumulated and this knowledge and this expertise and this experience and the intuition and make it mine? So I think that has been the process that I've had to come to. And that takes a lot of risk. It's not comfortable because I ended up quitting jobs. I ended up being broke. I ended up feeling lost. I ended up in a protracted dark night of the soul. Like my dark night of the soul was not one night. It wasn't like it wasn't no down on my knees on a night and then the next day I was good. No,
Right.
it was a long dark night of the soul.
Yeah, I think it's like people don't realize in that overarching hero's journey, there's lots of little hero's journeys
Yes.
along the way. And and as you said earlier, it's not linear. One of the things that you said that really strikes me, you get all this education, you do the work, you're doing all the things, and there's a point, I think, when you can learn so much, but there's a point when you have to synthesize it and integrate it, and then be able to use that information to help people see your perspective. Because when we're learning from all the people, all the dead white people, and now we're inviting a lot more voices into our learning scape, which is beautiful, that you're taking everybody's perspective. And when you realize that no perspective is right or wrong, it's just a perspective, that I can use that information to help me be able to more articulate my own perspective. And then I think that's a big piece of finding your voice, is being able to articulate your own perspective and in the process present it to the world where it becomes information and creation that other people can use to help find their own voice.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing that advances humanity forward or gets humanity deeper. And I think there are people on the planet who don't feel called in this way. For them, getting educated, going linearly through the path, getting the degree, becoming a lawyer, working as a lawyer, for some people, maybe even the majority of people, everything's on a bell curve. So in the center of that bell curve, you have the majority of people. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
It's just if you happen to be outside of that bell curve on either side, that central way of life isn't going to feel right for you.
Yeah.
So then you're probably going to go searching. Something else has to make sense if that center of the bell curve doesn't work for you.
Exactly. And that's a big part of why I work with entrepreneurs. I also work with leaders. I also work with creatives, but entrepreneurs are my main focus. But again, those are the people that are called to do something outside the middle of the bell curve.
Yeah.
And so that idea of being the wolf, really having to lean into that authenticity to be effective in those fields, you have to come from knowing your own voice.
100%. I, similar to you, am working, my order is a bit reversed. So I focus first on creatives and then probably leaders and then entrepreneurs. But they're all kind of in this same place of trying to find a voice that's authentic to them.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we get confused that the dollar amount that ends up in our bank account is what determines whether we've played our hand right. And it's not necessarily. There are pros and cons that come with anything you get handed in life. There are pros and cons that come with wealth. There are pros and cons that come with poverty. Obviously, deep poverty is really challenging. And I've been to some countries that are considered globally quite poor, but their sense of community is so strong.
Right.
And so, and you also meet billionaires who are really lonely and miserable. And yes, they have all this money, but they have nobody to spend time with or invite to their huge home. So what's the point?
Yep.
So I think reframing what it really means to find your own authentic path in life, to find your own voice, to find your own way, and whether or not and how to speak it, I think that conversation to some degree also needs to be redefined, because the idea that you're going to be famous, the idea that you're going to be rich, that's not going to happen necessarily just because you're successful or just because you're fulfilling your own destiny.
Well, I think the other piece too is, and this comes with defining and knowing your true voice, is knowing what's actually truly important to you.
Yes.
Because you can be filthy rich and get everything that's truly important to you. And you could be dirt poor and get everything that's really important to you.
Exactly.
And so there's a whole bunch of stuff in between. If you want to be rich and have everything that's important to you, you've got to break through some stuff around your voice and other subconscious stuff. Maybe you have issues with rich people, or maybe you think that they're jerks, or maybe you think money is evil, like all of these idioms that have been passed down through us that could be just that could be in your way, but usually it's something deeper within. So what could you say for somebody that's looking to find their own voice? What can they do on their own to tap more into their own authentic voice?
One thing is to really get in alignment and start to observe the connection between the body and the breath and the voice. So many of us don't think about, if you're not aware of the mechanics of voice, oftentimes we just think we have a thought and then it comes out of our mouths and it doesn't occur to us. Maybe somebody has said, please speak louder, please speak softer. And we may or may not know how to do that. But the idea of what happens from the moment I have an impulse to connect, from that moment, what happens between that moment and thought, breath, and execution of voice coming through the body. And what I'm usually dealing with when I'm working with people clinically is that somewhere in that process, there's a block. And that block could be physical, it could be manifesting as tension, it could be psychological, it could be spiritual, it could be fear of saying what I really think. I mean, there are the possibilities for how that block originates and then how it manifests. I mean, they're not infinite, but there are a lot of them.
Yeah. I
And
definitely work with people to overcome what's in their way of having difficult conversations. And we uncover so many blocks. So yeah, keep going.
yeah. So from my perspective, because I have the physiological training and the scientific training, A lot of it for me gets woven into what's going on in the body, what's going on in the pressure of the breath, the flow of the breath, and how do your breath pressure and flow correlate with your psychological pressure and flow. In other words, when we're feeling stress, and then how does that correlate then to the body's tension versus movement? And so if you can correlate all of those, then you'll see that you need some form of structure. You need a held position of musculature or a structure of a skeletal structure to hold everything in place. But if that becomes too rigid, you're going to be limiting flow. So that's true in breath, and that's true in body, and that's true in thought. So we need some structure that isn't rigidity and flow that isn't completely fluid, like flooding. So we need to not flood and we need to not get rigid. We need to have some structure and some flow in everything we do. So that is in the feeling in our heart, that is in our connection with our soul and in the fulfillment of our soul. That's in our intake of breath or outtake of breath. And then that's also in kind of the how the thinking then flows into the speaking. All those somehow need to find a way to connect.
So, what I'm hearing is that when we have a block, that there is something going on in the body that is creating the block or too much flow. So it's either too floppy or it's too rigid. And I go back to knowing that scientifically, the mind and the body are 100% connected. Every thought you have affects every cell in your body. And so when we think about the psychology of what's going on in the mind, then it's affecting the body, creating this floppiness or this rigidity
Mhm.
that's creating some fluctuation in the voice, and you're being able to communicate. And so, what I'm hearing is that you are excellent at determining the fluctuations in the voice to be able to determine what is the cause or what thing is causing the problem. And once you determine that, you can work on that specific thing so that you can have the voice that you need and be able to connect with the truth of your authentic voice. Does that sound
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, so if you consider, say, a female entrepreneur or a female CEO of a company, the models we have in society for being in positions of those kinds of positions of power are patriarchal, right? The models that we have in society are, in order to be successful, you go linearly, you go to law school, you study to be a lawyer, and then you go and you're directed, you're focused, you have a goal, you go achieve it. It's the hero's journey. The hero's journey is a very masculine approach to life in some sense. Now, when psychologists write about the heroine's journey, it's much more of a spiral. It's not cyclical, it doesn't keep going back to the same place, but it's a spiral in the sense that we gather wisdom, we gather intuition, we gather experience, and then we find ourselves seemingly at the same place, but we're not at the same place because we've learned something. And so then the spiral just keeps going up and keeps going up and keeps going around. And so we are elevating. So if I, for example, am working with a female CEO, let's say, I recently had a client who was a CEO who had shifted out of her position. And she realized that she had been borrowing the power and authority of her title to
Mhm.
have any sense of command over her life and world.
Yeah.
Once she was stripped of the title of CEO, she felt she'd lost her voice. And what she really realized was she'd never had her voice. It was never her voice to begin with because she was hiding behind the mask of her title, which was really not her. It was an image of a patriarchal, authoritarian person, and I'm sure she was fair and just. You can have fairness and justness in that patriarchal power as well. It doesn't have to be authoritative in a way that's abusing power, right? It can be, but it doesn't have to be. So if you think of even the best authoritative masculine patriarchal form who's fair and just and kind and is guiding you, it's still a patriarchal model. And so if you step out of that and you take off the pantsuit and you take off all those things that women, for example, have taken on in order to succeed in politics, in order to succeed in positions of leadership, and they step out of that and they say, you know what, this position isn't working for me, oftentimes they feel like they've lost their voice. The reality is they've never had it.
Right.
because they never really went through that authentic journey of figuring out, how do I express my own personal power that is not in anybody else's image, that's in my own image? And then that becomes the starting point of a new journey. For many people, often that happens at midlife. We live the first half of our lives, and then something happens, we lose a job, our kids leave the nest, whatever, and then we have to start over.
It's interesting. You talk about this from the women's perspective and the female journey. And I know that you primarily work with women.
Yes.
Yes. But it's interesting because I find that the same thing is happening with men because
Mhm.
it's still a mask that they put on
Yeah,
and they're not leading from their authentic voice.
100%.
And so what I see, like, I'm tapping more and more, as lots of us on this journey are tapping more and more into my authenticity, and I'm looking around trying to find somebody to model where I'm going, where I can see that I'm going. But what I see is that nobody is there. And I think when you're really on the path of authenticity, you're looking around and you can see that has a little glimmer of a quality I'm looking for, and this one. But you begin to realize there are no models for where you're going, and that you just have to get comfortable with the fact that you're going to be the one trailblazing the path of you.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And I think one of the things, if we haven't said it directly, one of the things that we kind of keep coming back to is what's inner and what's outer. And so whatever's inner is going, that impulse is going to guide anything that's from within me outward. Whereas the alternative is, I'm just going to look around me and see models of what's already happening and copy them, or allow somebody else's experience and authority. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about all the things written from Socrates onward by dead white European men. They observed what was around them and they wrote it down in books, and it became real, or it became law. It's not real. It's not law. It's still their experience and their observations, even when it's science. Science is transforming and changing all the time. So anybody can sit down and observe a situation and use their own intuition and their own experience and the books that have been written prior to them. Like, everybody takes the knowledge that has accumulated prior to them, and then they look into it and they say, okay, how does this resonate or not resonate with my own body? And once you can feel how it resonates or doesn't resonate with your own body, then you can begin your own task of finding your voice. Nobody comes blank slated. I mean, maybe we come in blank slated, but nobody gets to midlife blank slated. And even though I've chosen to focus on women, and I go back and forth on this a lot, and I probably at some point will stop making that niche so narrow, because what I've found is that more and more men are seeking me out. And I think men too are, I mean, I know men too are stuck in with this patriarchal image, whether they came up in a military family or their dad was a doctor, they had to become a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, whether they feel like they're forced into whatever it is, whatever power structure they've been told they should be in, but really at heart, they were a poet. Really at heart, they were a creative. Really at heart, they were an entrepreneur and didn't necessarily want to be a CEO of somebody else's company. Men, too, also, especially at midlife, are having to step back and say, that was never me. That was never me to begin with. And I get that that is the only image I'm being offered of masculine power, but it's killing me. I mean, it's killing me either through disease or heart attack or just mental anguish, or I'm not happy in my marriage and family, or I'm not able to be kind to my family because I'm unhappy. I mean, it goes on and on.
Yeah.
So I don't know that it's much different for men and women. I do think that they have different challenges in terms of finding their voices in some ways, but I feel like the overarching issue is the same. Are you, and do you, and did you have permission to be who you authentically really are and came onto this planet to be? Or are you always fighting against that because whether it's society or a family member or somebody else is telling you to be something different from what you really are?
Yeah. And I would almost argue, or no, I would argue that men might even at this point might need you or finding the authentic voice even more than women, because as since the 70s, as women have been fighting for their equality and have been fighting for their freedom, they have had a model of where they're going, whereas men have not. Like, all of a sudden, as women gain more autonomy and authenticity and internal power, the men are being left more and more with, well, what am I supposed to do? Because it was always their job to protect or to provide. And so I think a lot of what men are really struggling with, where do I fit in this new world that is forming? And the only place that you fit, honestly, is from your authentic self. So I do think, I think both genders are having a lot of struggle. And I think that we are championing, I can't do the word, but you guys know what I mean. Women's journey towards this path, because we've been at it a lot longer, fighting for this truth and authenticity and our own internal power. And men have not been on that path as long. So I think a lot of men are really struggling right now.
Agreed. And like I said, more and more men are seeking me out. I mean, I have a client right now who's in his 70s and was an artist, was a poet, and ended up getting married young and having kids young, and then got stuck in a career because he had a wife and kids, and that was what he was supposed to do. And then lived out the rest of his life feeling like he was living the wrong life until his wife finally left him and his kids grew up. And then now he's 70 and about to retire. And he's like, now do I get to be who I am? Now do I get to be myself? And yes, he does. And so that's part of why I developed the program I just mentioned, my Soundscapes of the Psyche program, where I help people listen to their own voice. And I have a process that I take them through to help them hear themselves like I hear them, is because I think, like you were saying, for women in particular, talk therapy is when we're struggling. Talk therapy or some sort of talking coaching is usually where we go. But most women I know, at least, we have girlfriends, we have community, we talk all the time. And we were always encouraged to go to our girlfriends and bounce something off of them. We were always encouraged to be emotional at least within our circles, maybe not in the greater collective, but we always had a best girlfriend, or at least we do now, even if grade school wasn't great. But at some point, most girls end up with a girlfriend they can talk to. Men don't have that. And I know that partly because I have two brothers who are sensitive men. And I just have a lot of sensitive, artistic men in my life. My nephews are sensitive men. My cousins are sensitive men. And even patients of mine that I had clinically, I mean, these big, tough, like construction workers and CEOs of companies, people that you would think would be the gruffest humans on the planet. It was like, oh my God, somebody's finally listening to me. You know, they'd come into my office, they'd sit down and they'd talk to me and they were like, what do I do with this? She's actually listening. And they would just be sobbing from day one, because everyone projects onto this image of, you're tall, you're big, you're white, you're whatever, you must have a great life. Everything's easy for you. You're tough. No, there were little boys that have grown up into men. And so just because they're in that shape, I mean, some of them, yeah, if they fit into patriarchy, they're doing great. They're fine, although that's arguable as well. They think they're doing fine. But at core, we're all just little tiny people who grew up into big bodies and we're expected to know what we do. None of us do. None of us has any idea what we're doing. We're all just guessing. And yeah, I agree. I mean, I think sometimes men get it worse because they have no outlet and nobody's listening to them and nobody expects them to have emotions or express them.
Right.
And they don't have some of them do, but most men bemoan that their relationships with other men are not that intimate. And if they're married, they often can't have that kind of intimate relationship with a female friend. I mean, it's just, the whole thing's a mess. So who do you talk to and who do you get to be your authentic self with?
Yeah. And of course, where they would get that outlet would be from their romantic partners. But if the romantic partner doesn't need them anymore, then where do they have that outlet? Now they have no outlet. Okay. We could go on about that forever. I have a couple more quick questions, but before that, I want you to tell everybody how they can work with you, how they can do the soundscape thing. Tell us how to get in touch with you.
Yeah. So the best way is probably to set up a call with me. And we can put a Calendly link, I guess, in the show notes if that works. They can also just reach out to me with my personal email, sohaaljurf@gmail.com. And then my website is sohaaljurf.com. So any of those ways are ways to find me.
Okay, great. And quickly, for those entrepreneurs who are looking to break through some of the stuff that we've talked about that want to succeed in their business, I've got a free guide out there, The 3 Secrets the Business Gurus Never Talk About. And you'll learn some stuff that is root cause stuff of some of the stuff that we've been talking about, and some tips on how you can break through that on your own. And that you can grab at bethewolfgift.com. So, speaking of breaking through some stuff on your own, if you were going to give some people a tip or two to start to tap into or find their own voice, what's a tip or two that they could do on their own if they're too scared yet to make that call and work with you?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it may sound obvious or cliche, but I think the first thing is just to pay attention to your breath, and especially the in-breath. I think not enough people pay attention to the fact that before they speak, there's that process of impulse or thought, opening the mouth, intaking the breath, and then putting out the breath. Even if you start to pay attention to that, you're going to notice when that impulse to speak is filled with the sense of power, is filled with pressure and a balance of pressure and flow, or is filled with something holding it back or anxiety. And if you can start to notice those patterns of, wow, okay, wait a minute, I have a pattern every time I have a thought and I have an impulse to speak or express, everything closes up. I don't breathe. If you can start to notice what those patterns are, you'll start to kind of get a sense of where your voice is getting choked up. And the other thing that I often recommend is that people observe other people that they think have no trouble speaking. So if you look out into television, newscasters, actors, your own meeting groups of colleagues, groups of friends, just even in public, cab drivers, grocery store owners, et cetera, start to notice other people's patterns and notice how they're using their breath, how they're using their body, how they're using their resonance structures in their mouth and head, what their voice sounds like, and what that, again, that pressure and flow balance feels and sounds like to you, and then how you're interpreting that. So when you meet people that you think seem confident versus people who seem insecure, people who are heard by others, if you notice, like, why is everybody always listening to this other person? Or how does this person get heard? How are they using their voice, literally and figuratively? What's the energy that's coming through them when they speak? How do they demonstrate their authority? How does somebody balance, that authority with not seeing authoritative? So, when they express their authority, are they still doing it with love and gentleness and support and kindness, or do they go into being patronizing and aggressive? And how do I perceive people who are loud? A lot of people who pull back on their voices, it's because they have an internalized belief that what other people might see as confident is angry, aggressive, rude, taking up too much space. So you got to start to break all that stuff down to figure out what is it that you want, where's the gap between where you are and where you want to be, and what's it gonna take to fill that gap.
And I want to just put this out there. When you're paying attention to what's going on with other people, this isn't a comparison like they have something that I'm missing. It is an observation as to what is happening for them. And is there something useful for me to learn from it? How can I be inspired from it, as opposed to making it mean there's something wrong with me?
Or something wrong with them. I mean, you're just collecting data. You're just being a scientist. You're just saying, like, wow, there's no objective thought on, many of us have our favorites in terms of actors and actresses, and both of us might watch the same actress and think, oh, I like her style, and the other might be like, no, I don't like her style at all. The point is to figure out in your own psychology what you're perceiving. And so what breath flow pattern, what rate pattern are you perceiving? There are people who perceive me as the most loving, gentle spirit soul on the earth, and there are people who think I'm aggressive. So, depending on your perspective of what you consider loving or what you consider smart or what you can, right, however it's going through your own filter, you're going to interpret it potentially differently. And if you perceive me as aggressive, that either means that you need to look at your own stuff in terms of what you're perceiving as aggressive, or that I need to look at my own stuff, or that we're not a good fit. It's totally
Right.
fine. It's totally fine. But so just getting a handle on what am I drawn to, what makes sense to me and why, and does that mean that it's in alignment with my soul, or does that mean it's actually something I need to look at and perhaps consider shifting?
Nice. So one last question. You had a 20-year journey trying to step more fully into your own voice.
Mhm.
And if we go back to not the full 20 years, but the point when you had developed mastery over helping people heal their voice, I guess would be a
Mhm.
great way to say it. At that point, once you had a pretty solid mastery of that, what did you need to know to take the next leap into finding your own voice that could have, I mean, I know there are no wrong turns, but that could have sped your process up?
What did I need to know in order to find my own voice?
Yeah.
That I hadn't found it. I
Ah.
mean, I think that I had never considered that question for myself until I was honestly in my early 40s, and I had been on this 20-year trajectory of what's wrong? What am I missing? I mean, and again, I was hired by the San Francisco Opera as a consultant. Like, I was at the top of my game on paper. People really reached out to me because they thought I knew what I was talking about. And so why was I so unhappy? Why was I not finding the thing? And I finally was I worked with therapist after therapist, and I learned a lot. I learned about how to communicate with others, and I learned a lot about relationships. I mean, I learned a lot. But I was in my early 40s, and I was sitting in an office of a Jungian therapist where I live in Tucson now, actually. She was great, but we were still going in circles. I'd been working with her for 6 months, a year, and I was like, I've been doing this for 20 years. Of what am I missing? What am I missing?" And she said, "Soha, for all the work you've done helping people find their own voice, their voices, I don't know that you've found your own voice." And so it really forced me to ask that question, what would that even mean? Because I don't think of myself as somebody who doesn't have a voice, right? I don't think of myself as somebody who's afraid to speak. I'm on the contrary, I'm always getting in trouble for speaking out, or I feel like I'm always the one who's saying what's on her mind. And so if speaking my mind or whatever it was I was doing, finding my career path, helping others, doing all the things, if that hadn't gotten me to a place where I'd found my voice, then what would? What did it really mean to unapologetically be completely unafraid and bravely just feel into myself, like know thyself, take a breath and speak, or choose to be silent out of wisdom, not out of fear? And that trajectory is what I really realized was what I'd been trying to do all along. And so that's the process I've been in for the last 10 years.
That is incredibly powerful. You needed to know that you had not yet found your voice. And I throw that word yet in there because I think that's really important. Well, thank you, Soha, for sharing your journey and your wisdom and your spirit with us today. And remember, everybody, this whole conversation is a true vibration of what I always say at the end of the show, which is when you unleash the power of you, humanity evolves. We'll see you all next time on Be the Wolf. Bye, everyone.